In school, we're taught about the most important events that have taken place throughout history and people who were involved. But what the history books often don't include are the strange events that have never been explained. To this day, some of these mysteries remain unsolved, and the chances of us finding out what really happened grow slimmer with every passing year. Number 10. One wouldn't normally associate telepathy with an animal like a chicken. But during one curious case that took place in Pennsylvania in 1940, this was indeed the case, with a woman named Gertrude Smith, who seemed to have some sort of telepathic bond with her chickens. Under normal circumstances, telepathy is the ability for two people to communicate with each other without using any of their usual senses, instead relying on their thoughts being transferred into each other's minds. The existence of telepathy has been debated for a very long time, but to date it's not been proven as real, despite many people claiming to have this ability. It's even been studied by some governments as a way to get the upper hand during wartime, with varying degrees of success. As for Gertrude, she claimed to have such special abilities, and in 1940, she traveled from her house, which was located on West King Street, to the offices of the York Gazette and Daily newspaper to prove that she had a mental link with the chickens that she had raised. In a previous letter to the same publication, she stated that when she was a child growing up in York, she was coached in telepathy, clairvoyance, and clairaudience, which is the ability to hear things that other people aren't able to. Following this, she would often hold psychic sessions, never as a professional, but with her friends and family, and they were astonished at the fact that her abilities seemed completely genuine. She then decided to try them on her chickens. She decided that she wanted them to lay eggs with patterns on them, rather than the same old dull eggs that they usually produced. She had a specific pattern in mind, the center of a sunflower with its petals extending outward. She thought it would be an interesting experiment to see whether they could pick up on her thoughts, and to do so she started speaking to them as she would one of her friends. She claimed that some of the chickens would start singing to her upon hearing her request. To help get her message across even further, she planted several sunflower seeds, but her plan worked sooner than she thought it would. Before the first sunflower had opened its petals, she was surprised to find an egg containing the exact pattern that she had thought about on its shell. She waited for the sunflowers to bloom and then repeated the experiment, and once again one of her hens laid an egg with the sunflower pattern. But this time, she had a witness that could corroborate her story. She ended this letter by asking for the address of Robert Ripley, the creator of Ripley's Believe It or Not, presumably so that she could demonstrate her ability to him. A month later, she arrived at the newspaper's offices with one of her eggs in hand. To the newspaper staff's surprise, the egg did indeed contain one of these patterns on its shell, but they were of course still skeptical since they didn't actually see the hen laying this egg. According to some sources, Gertrude continued showing off her skills to members of the public, many of whom believed that she really could communicate with her hens telepathically. Number 9. In 1987, a strange event took place in Atlanta, Georgia that has not been explained to this day, and the details of which are truly bizarre. It concerns a house on 1114 Fountain Drive that belonged to 77-year-old Minnie Clyde Winston and her husband, 79-year-old William. The couple had lived in the house for more than 20 years and had raised 3 children there. By the time that the mysterious events played out in the house, their children were already grown and had set out on their own. At the time, William was suffering from kidney problems, and Minnie spent most of her time looking after him. He had to undergo dialysis on a daily basis, and the constant care he had needed started to take its toll on her. On the 8th of September of that year, exhausted from the day's activities, she decided to take a long soak in the bath. She took her time to unwind and only got out of the bath at about 11:30 p.m. But then something happened that terrified her as she couldn't explain it. As she got out of the bath, she felt something wet under her feet. At first, she thought some of her bath must have spilled out, but she immediately realized that the liquid seemed much slicker than water, and when she looked down, she realized it looked like biological material. She thought that she may have unknowingly cut the sole of one of her feet, but quickly realized that this wasn't the case when she saw that the liquid seemed to be coming from beneath the bathroom floor tiles, and it seemed to be spraying up through the floor like a sprinkler. She and Willie inspected the house and found the same liquid coming out of the walls in the kitchen in their hallway, and even the basement and crawl space. Even their bedroom was affected, and they didn't know what to make of it. It seemed to them as though the house had started bleeding for some reason, and terrified, they called 911. When EMTs arrived, they examined the couple for injuries but found none. They also saw the liquid oozing from the walls and floors but couldn't find a source. Willie stated that he locked the house at around 9:30 that night. They hadn't had any visitors, and hence they couldn't explain how the liquid could have gotten under the floors and into the house's walls. Samples of the liquid were collected and sent to a laboratory to be analyzed. When the results came back, the couple was horrified to learn that it was indeed biological material. But even more macabre was the fact that it was confirmed as human. Further tests revealed that it didn't come from either Minnie or William, since the liquid was found to be type O and they were both type A. The police were informed, but they had no idea what to do, since no crime had seemingly been committed. It was briefly suggested that either the Winstons or someone else had staged the event as a hoax, but as the investigation progressed, this seemed ever less likely. The media had a field day with the story, which eventually became too much for the couple, and before long they refused to give any more interviews. The investigation lasted for about a month and a half, but the source of the liquid was never found, and it remains a mystery that will likely never be solved. Number 8. Most of us are familiar with Mary Shelley, the author of the classic novel Frankenstein. But not everyone knows that her husband Percy was also a writer and an accomplished poet in his own right, who, according to historical accounts, was a rather eccentric character. In May of 1922, he and Mary had just moved to Italy, where they rented a house along with his sister, Claire Claremont, and another couple, Edward and Jane Williams. Their house was set in a remote area, but right on the beach, and the sea would often reach right up to its terrace. Upon first arriving at the house, Mary was quickly disillusioned, stating that she wasn't fond of the house or the area, but Percy found the home and its surroundings inspirational, and he started writing a poem called The Triumph of Life. Before long, this difference in opinion started taking a toll on the couple's marriage, as Mary grew ever more discontent. Those living in the house with her would state that she often burst into fits of rage, or when that wasn't the case, seemed completely indifferent to what was happening around her. Her hatred for the house only grew, and she told Percy that she felt as though something terrible was going to happen to them. And as it was turned out, she was correct. Percy started acting strangely, and one night he caused Edward a lot of concern with his odd behavior. The two men were out on the house's terrace when Percy suddenly jumped up and pointed out into the ocean, shouting, "There it is again." Edward couldn't see what he was referring to, but Percy told him that he could see a small child rising out of the ocean while looking at him with a smile on its face and its hand clasped together. But still, Edward saw nothing. Not long after that, Percy woke everyone in the house when he started yelling that he had a vision of the Williams couple and that they'd been horribly injured. He also saw the beach house flooded by the ocean, along with a strange man standing over Mary while strangling her. Strangely, he didn't recognize the man at first, but when he managed to get a look at his face, he realized that it was his own. He then revealed that a few days prior, he'd been out on the terrace during the day when his doppelganger walked up to him, looked him right in the eyes, and asked, "How much longer do you mean to be content?" It had become clear that Percy was not doing well mentally, but with Mary in an indifferent state and the Williams at their wits' end, there was not much that could be done about it. On the 1st of July of that year, 3 months after arriving at the house, Percy and Edward decided to go boating, and they took Percy's boat, named the Don Juan, to Livorno. It had been fitted with extra equipment to make it sail faster, but unbeknownst to the two men, these modifications made the vessel quite dangerous. It would become unstable once it was fully loaded. They stayed in the area for the next week, after which Percy decided to sail back, despite being warned that bad weather was approaching. Williams traveled with him, as did Charles Vivian, an 18-year-old man who worked as a boat boy. Shortly after they set sail, the vessel was in trouble in high seas, and a captain from another boat approached them for help, but Percy refused to leave his boat and also physically prevented his companions from leaving. Before long, the three men were overtaken by the waves, and they'd be found deceased 10 days later. Many people feel that if they hadn't listened to his doppelganger and rather chose to remain content instead of setting sail that day, things would have turned out very differently. Number 7. Since time immemorial, people have been pondering the possibility of immortality, but have always found it to be nothing more than a fantasy. But there's one man who claimed to be immortal, and to this day, no one has been able to prove otherwise. The man in question called himself Count de Saint-Germain, and it's believed that he was born sometime in the 1690s, though some people believe he was alive at the time of Christ. Some records state that his father was the Prince of Transylvania, but this has never been proven beyond a doubt. It's certain, though, that he was a talented alchemist, and that he was in pursuit of turning base metals into gold, as so many alchemists at the time were. At the time, many people believed that this could be achieved with a philosopher's stone, a mythical substance that, when added to these base metals, would turn them into gold or silver. But it had more than one purpose. According to legend, if this substance, also sometimes referred to as projection powder, was ingested, it could cause that person to become immortal, and many people believe that Count de Saint-Germain had not only found the Philosopher's Stone, but had achieved immortality. According to historical accounts, he studied alchemy in the court of the Shah of Persia from 1738 to 1742, after which he traveled to Europe, where he settled in the high society. He was an accomplished musician, had a quick wit, and soon found himself in favor with the royals, who were enthralled by his knowledge of science. They were also astounded by the fact that he could speak 7 languages, including German, Dutch, Spanish, and Russian fluently, while having a good understanding of Chinese, Arabic, Greek, Latin, and Sanskrit. Rumors about his immortality started to spread in 1760, when Saint-Germain traveled to Madame de Pompadour's home for a party. And the news reached Countess von Georgi, who was curious to meet him, since she'd known a man with the same name 50 years earlier in Venice in 1710. She attended the party, and upon seeing Saint-Germain was astonished to find he hadn't aged a day, and she assumed that the man that she knew years earlier was his father, but he assured her that he was the man she knew back then. The Countess was skeptical since the Saint-Germain that she knew was already 45 in 1710, the same age as the man standing in front of her. He assured her that he was almost 100 years old and recounted some of their previous encounters, convincing her that he was indeed that same man. Over the next 4 decades, people all over Europe would meet Saint-Germain, and by all accounts he never aged a day. Throughout the years, he mastered the violin, became a well-known painter, joined several secret societies, and often spent meal times with his friends, but was only ever seen eating oatmeal despite seemingly being very healthy. No matter where he traveled, he always set up his laboratory where he claimed to be able to fuse small diamonds into bigger ones, and of course, that he could create gold out of scraps of worthless metal. It's said that he had the ear of many leaders, including King Louis XV of France and Marie Antoinette. He was thought to have passed away in Germany in 1779, but many people reported seeing him there 6 years later, and Freemason records show that he was still part of that society that same year. He was then seen in France in 1789, still looking like a man in his 40s, and in 1897, more than a century later, a French singer named Emma Cave signed a photo of herself to a man named Count Saint-Germain. The last time that he was seen was in Paris in 1972, where he allegedly still claimed to be able to turn metals into gold, and even appeared on a television show. Number 6. When someone goes missing, articles often use the phrase vanished as if into thin air, which is of course just a figure of speech. But one incident that took place in 1878 seems to embody that very phrase, as a young man really did, according to his family, literally vanish without a trace. The incident took place in Quincy, Illinois, where the Ashmore family lived on a farm, having relocated there after living in Troy, New York, and Richmond, Indiana. Christian Ashmore bought a farm there, where he and his wife lived along with their 2 adult daughters, their 16-year-old son Charles and Christian's mother. They soon settled in and started making a lot of friends. They were known to be rather well off financially and were described as a respectable family. The house had a steady water supply from a nearby spring that would remain in flow during the snowy winter months, and that's where this unsettling incident would take place. On the 9th of November, 1878, Charles decided to go out to the spring at around 9 p.m. The family was gathered around the fire hearth when he took a tin bucket and announced that he would be back shortly after getting some water. When he hadn't returned some time later, they became concerned since it had been snowing and temperatures had dropped dramatically. Christian went to the door and called out to him since the spring was close by, but he got no reply, only further distressing the rest of the family. Christian decided to go look for his son, and to do so, he grabbed a lantern to light the way. The older daughter, Martha, decided to accompany him despite his objections, and together they ventured out into the snow. The path to the spring was completely covered with snow, so they could see Charles's footprints clearly, which they then followed. At this point, they must have been confident that they would find him soon enough, since they merely had to follow his very obvious trail. But this was not the case. They walked about halfway to the well when Christian suddenly froze in his tracks, lifted his lantern, and peered into the darkness, prompting Martha to ask him what was wrong, but she quickly realized what had startled him. Looking down, she noticed that Charles's footprints suddenly stopped in the middle of nowhere, as if he'd been snatched up or simply disappeared. The last two footprints were no different than the others, suggesting that he hadn't broken into a run or scuffled with anyone, and the surrounding snow seemed strangely undisturbed. Out of instinct, Christian looked up into the sky, but could only see the stars overhead. He thought that the rest of Charles's tracks may have been covered up by the new snowfall, but there wasn't a cloud to be seen. The pair then walked onto the spring, and upon arriving there, they saw that it was still completely frozen over, meaning that Charles had never dunked the bucket into the water. They retraced their steps, noting that there were no other footprints anywhere in the area, but they had no choice but to wait for daybreak. But even then, the snow offered no clues. Charles had simply vanished. His mother, who was devastated by his disappearance, would then go out to the spring to get water 4 days later, but when she came running back into the house, she had an incredible tale. She stated that when she passed by the spot where Charles's footprints ended, she could hear his voice and she called out to him, but each of his replies seemed to be coming from a different spot. She chased his voice until she was exhausted and couldn't make out what it was saying, but she was adamant that it was Charles that she had spoken to. At first, the family believed that she was simply hallucinating due to her sadness, but the rest of the family would hear the same voice in the same area in the months to come. They all stated that the voice seemed as though it was coming from far away, and over time it grew ever softer until Charles was heard no more, and his disappearance was never solved. Number 5. People have reported seeing strange lights in the sky for a very long time. In ancient times, they were often associated with the gods, while today many people believe they're the result of extraterrestrial craft that either fly through our atmosphere or visit Earth for reasons unknown. But there is another type of light phenomenon that has left scientists baffled, as they don't appear in the sky but under the ocean, usually close to islands. And many people believe that it's thanks to these strange lights that explorers were able to find their way across the oceans as many as 6,000 years ago. In Western literature, the first mention of these lights, known as Telapa, which translates to the flashing, was in the 1970s in a book entitled We the Navigators. Until then, it was assumed that Pacific Island travelers simply got their boats and floated with the currents until they happened upon a new piece of land. But this book shattered that belief, as it contained several means by which explorers navigated their way across the seas. Dr. Ariane George is known to be one of the first Westerners to ever see Telapa with their own eyes, when she witnessed these strange lights near the Solomon Islands. Once she reached the islands, she spoke to a chief called Coloso Kahia Kavea, who shared what he knew about the lights. He explained that they travel in straight lines, like lights from a flashlight that's turned on and off very quickly. She also made some of her own observations, realizing that the lights always traveled out into the ocean from a landmass, such as an island. This meant that if ancient sailors came to this same realization, they could simply look for these lights while out in the ocean, and then follow them to a new territory that they had never seen before. Those who have seen the Telapa lights state that they often reach as far as 120 miles into the ocean, which suggests that they may have been seen by many an ancient traveler who could then easily follow them to land. Kavea stated that he often used these lights to navigate around the islands, and that he found them to be very reliable. He's also certain that ancient Polynesian sailors used the lights as a type of compass to find unexplored lands. But we're unable to explain exactly what these lights are. Dr. George has stated that she doesn't know of any scientific explanation and doesn't believe that any real effort is being made to study them further. But she does have a theory. She believes that when ocean swells meet, they form crests that somehow capture light sources such as the moon, that then look to the human eye as if light is traveling under the water. But this remains just a theory, and the real cause remains a mystery. Number 4. When someone sustains a serious injury, it often results in them losing some of their abilities, such as sight, hearing, or in some cases, one of their limbs. All of these are life-changing scenarios, but what if someone were to have an accident, only to wake up with abilities that they didn't have before? It may sound like the plot of a Hollywood movie, but this really did happen to a man named Derek Amato in 2006. One night, he was visiting a friend's house who was hosting a party, and at one stage, he decided to go for a swim in their pool. He changed into his swimming gear and dove into the pool, not realizing that it was much shallower than he thought. He entered the water too steeply and hit his head on the bottom, but didn't realize that he'd been injured. When he surfaced, his friends stood on the side of the pool, wide-eyed, as they asked him if he was all right. He made his way to the side of the pool, still certain that he was fine, where they then helped him out of the water. In the days that followed, he realized he was suffering from memory loss and that his hearing had been affected by the accident, and he decided to see a doctor who diagnosed him with a severe concussion as a result of a blow to his head. He was given medication and told to take it easy for a while until the concussion was better, but Derek would soon learn that the injury was far more of an effect on him than he initially realized. 4 days after hitting his head, he walked past a piano and sat down to play the only song he ever learned to play, Chopsticks, which is usually one of the first tunes a beginner at the piano learns to play. But instead of banging out chopsticks like he usually did, he started playing the piano as if he'd been playing the instrument his entire life. To his astonishment, he became somewhat of a virtuoso, but had no idea how that was possible. He was once again taken for medical assessment and then diagnosed as having musical savant syndrome, whereby someone with a brain injury suddenly finds themselves able to play an instrument like a professional, sometimes without ever having taken a single lesson. Realizing that he had to make use of his newfound talent, Derek started composing music and released his first album called Full Circle the next year. He's since also become involved with several brain injury charities. During an interview, he told a news outlet that the concussion he sustained in the pool that day wasn't his first, and that he had suffered about 7 when he was young, mostly while on the playground with his friends. In the years later, he played baseball and started doing martial arts, which resulted in a few more concussions. He was told that these injuries could cause scar tissue on his brain, and that his cerebellum was affected, causing him to struggle with his balance at times. He also still has problems with his memory at times. Sometimes he can recall events from long ago, but in others he struggles to remember what happened 5 minutes ago. But he says that he tries not to think about it too much and instead chooses to focus on his strange new gift. Number 3. Earthquakes are among the most destructive forces on Earth, depending on their strength in the areas where they hit. The strongest earthquake ever recorded took place in Valdivia, Chile in 1960, when a 9.5 magnitude quake hit the area, resulting in unimaginable destruction and the loss of many lives. While the quake was certainly destructive, most of the damage was done by the resulting tsunami that hit the country's coast. And alarmingly, it's thought that the tectonic plates that caused it have not yet released all of the energy caused by their rubbing together, suggesting that another massive quake could occur in the same area in the future. This is a terrifying thought, but imagine living in an area where an earthquake swarm occurs. This is when a series of quakes hit a relatively small area in a short time period, which is what happened in Matsushiro, Japan, over the course of 2 years. Between 1965 and 1967, more than 1 million earthquakes hit the area, with 6,780 of these taking place in one day, the 17th of April, 1966. Most of the quakes weren't very destructive, but some resulted in an unusual phenomenon called seismo-electromagnetic phenomenon, strange magnetic fields that occur during some earthquakes, along with something even more alarming: earthquake lights, known as EQLs. An amateur photographer named T. Kuribashi was the first to photograph these lights, and when all was said and done, he managed to capture 18 of these strange events with his camera. though it's been speculated that some of the photos may actually show bolts of lightning, the sun, moon, or artificial lighting. One photo, though, shows a ring of light about 5 miles in diameter over a mountainous area that had experienced one of these earthquakes. Witnesses who saw this light stated that it lasted for over 90 seconds, but strangely, it appeared before and after the quake occurred. This meant that they likely weren't caused directly by the shifting of tectonic plates, unlike the magnetic fields that were observed. It was suggested that the lights were caused by a buildup of CO2 and conditions in the atmosphere, since they were often seen during a cold front. Several more of these lights were seen during the 2 years that the earthquake swarm took place, and in some cases they appeared in different colors. On one occasion, witnesses described seeing a blue, almost purple set of lights appear over a mountainous region, but they were unable to explain what had caused them, since they didn't seem to coincide with any tremors. In other areas, this phenomenon has appeared as balls of light, as sheets, or as streams of light in the sky, while on other occasions they appear as a steady glow rather than a flash. While we have no idea what causes this, it's been suggested that it may be because of rocks grinding against each other, causing charges to build up inside them that are then released as the light that witnesses have seen. But this remains mere speculation. Number 2. Pareidolia is a strange phenomenon whereby the human brain turns completely normal patterns, such as those found on wall tiles and floors, into human faces. This happens because our brains naturally look for recognizable shapes, such as faces, to make sense of the world around us. And most of us will experience this many times during our lives. But some cases that are similar to pareidolia are thought to be more sinister, and in some cases, downright disturbing. For example, in one case that took place in a small town in Spain in 1971, a man heard his neighbor screaming in the dead of night, and alarmed, he ran outside to see what was happening. Upon reaching the house, he was surprised to find that a crowd had already gathered, and that they were staring in disbelief at a set of faces that had appeared on the house's floor. The case is known as the Belmez faces, named after the town where the incident took place. The family that lived in the house took this to be a bad sign, and they decided to destroy the faces, but no matter what they did, they would always reappear, causing the townspeople to believe that this was a paranormal phenomenon. It became known as the House of Faces, and soon people flocked from far away to see it for themselves. Strangely, the faces weren't always the same. Each time that they were destroyed, they would return in a different form, sometimes looking like a woman or a child, and each time, each of the faces would have a different expression. This continued for the next 30 years, and while some believe it was a hoax played by the family, others believe the faces were very real and could find no explanation. But this is by no means the only time that this strange phenomenon has occurred. One of the most recent cases took place in Calgary, Canada in 2004, when a woman named Karen Henused looked out of a window of her house and noticed something strange on one of the outside walls. She went outside to investigate, and to her surprise found 2 alien-looking faces staring back at her. The faces have never been there before, and she was left baffled. She called the nanny who was working at the house at the time, and she also saw the faces, but could offer no explanation. When she saw the images, the hairs on her arms stood up, and she started feeling uneasy. Karen waited for her husband to come home from work, and as soon as he walked through the door, she grabbed him by the arm and dragged him outside. The faces were still on the wall, and he too was unable to explain what was causing them. Photos taken of the marks show 2 white figures, each seemingly staring out from the wall. Their eyes were clearly visible, and above their heads something akin to a halo could be seen. A neighbor who saw the images was so shocked by what she saw that her first instinct was to think about moving away, but she actually thinks the faces look friendly. Strangely, the faces disappear each night, only to return at around 4 p.m. every afternoon, leading many people to believe that they're caused by a reflection off a window, but this has never been proven, and for now it remains a mystery. Number 1. Carol Novak is, by many accounts, a man who never existed. His case started on the 24th of June, 1955, when he was detained by Czechoslovakian soldiers. He was immediately suspected of being a spy, and so he was searched, but the soldiers were surprised to find that he carried no identification, and that he could neither speak nor hear. He did his best to communicate using sign language, but this did little to clear up the mystery of who he was and where he came from. But he did have a bag with him, and when it was searched, it was found to contain a sharpened blade, shaving razor, some Polish food items, and a napkin. This further strengthened their suspicions that he was a spy and that he'd entered the country illegally, so he was arrested. During the resulting interrogation, he was able to convey that his name was Carol Novak and that he was unable to remember most of his life up to that point, since he was suffering from memory loss. But he could recall that he was born in what is now Czechia in 1934, and that he's never been able to speak or hear. He explained that during the winter, he had a job helping skiers, and on one occasion he got lost and just kept walking until he reached the border where he then was detained. But this seemed like a fanciful tale, since no one could find any record of him being born in Radost, as he had claimed, and no one in the town of Graz, where he claimed he was from, had ever seen him before. One war refugee claimed that he'd seen Carol at a refugee camp in Nuremberg, Germany, in both 1951 and 54, and that the man on that occasion had spoken Czech, though he had a foreign accent. He claimed that Carol was a CIA agent, but this was never proven. Another man reported that he'd met Carol in Austria, also at a refugee camp, and that he had burns on his arms that had been regularly bandaged. The man in custody did have these marks on his arms, but he claimed that he got them while doing gymnastics. Medical tests were found to be inconclusive, and no one knew whether he really was deaf and mute. Following this, Carol was sent to Austria, where he received treatment for his condition at a special facility. He was also given 2 years of basic education, after which he was sent back to Czechoslovakia, but having nowhere to go, he ended up in a train station in Ostrava. He would do seasonal work on occasion, such as picking mushrooms, but he was soon found to have faked his medical conditions when he was followed and observed speaking and hearing normally. It would then come to light that he was highly intelligent and proficient with a firearm, but no one could find any information on his past. He was sent to prison for 12 years for espionage, but this had little effect on him. Carol passed away on the 17th of November 1981, and when his apartment was checked, it was found to have already been searched by someone else. Some items in the apartment were covered in a strange chemical, but neither this substance nor Carol were ever positively identified. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But my name is Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.